Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment Decision Day. I'm going to turn it over to our head analyst, Jacob Polikoff, to get us started. Jacob.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Today we're going to start in the white packet with page 16. That's going to be the Maryland Tax Court, and the analyst will take it from there. We will go through in order through the rest of the document, and then at the end we will swing back to do the first 15 pages. And if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to ask any of us. Thank you.
On page 16, the recommendation for the Maryland Tax Court was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Thank you.
On page 17, we have the Public Service Commission. Item 1 is a committee narrative requesting a report on monthly data on residential utility terminations and arrearage. The agency concurred with the recommendation. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 18, this action deletes 2 new positions and associated funding provided in Supplemental Budget 1. The House adopted the action.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 19, we have the Office of People's Counsel. DLS recommended concurring with governor's allowance. The agency concurred. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 20.
I still have an additional page. Actually, I have an additional page for the Public Service Commission. It's on page 1 of the green packet. This is a committee narrative requesting a report on apprenticeships within the public utilities industries.
I move to adopt.
Second.
And there is an additional page for the Office of People's Counsel on page 2 of the green packet. This deletes 1 new position and associated funding provided in the supplemental budget.
Move to reject.
Page 20, the Subsequent Injury Fund. Concur with governor's allowance. The agency concurs and the House adopts.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 21, the Uninsured Employers Fund. DLS recommends for UEF to submit a report on whether a third-party administrator is needed for the entire current 5-year contract. Agency concurs. House adopts.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 22, the Workers' Compensation Commission. DLS recommends to increase the turnover expectancy to 7%, which is around a $554,000 special fund reduction. Agency concurs. House adopts.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 23 of the Chesapeake Bay overview, it's a non-budgeted agency. Agency concurred and of course House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 24, we have the Maryland Energy Administration. Item 1 reduces funds allocated for reclassification, which were double budgeted. The agency did not provide a response for this. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 2 is a committee narrative requesting report on Strategic Energy Investment Fund revenue, spending, and fund balance. The agency concurred. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 3 on page 25 is a committee narrative requesting Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act funding for energy-related purposes. The agency concurred with the recommendation. House modified to request information on plans if federal funds become unavailable.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 4 on page 27 is a committee narrative requesting report on MEA funding. The agency concurred and House adopted.
Move to concur.
On item 5 on page 28 is a committee narrative requesting report on uses of CIF revenues transferred to the dedicated purpose account. The agency concurred and House adopted. There is a modification in the green packet, page number 4. This modifies the narrative to reflect the funds realigned by the Supplemental Budget 1 to provide $50 million to MEA and $50 million to Maryland Department of Transportation.
Move to reject and adopt the additional action.
Second.
On page 29 of the white packet, This action makes the appropriation contingent on legislation authorizing the expanded use of the funds. The House adopted the action.
Move to concur.
The Governor's Office of Crime.
Oh, I'm sorry. There is an additional page in the green packet, page 3. It is a committee narrative requesting a report on battery storage capacity.
Move to adopt.
Second.
The Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Policy begins on page 30. The first recommendation is to withhold funds pending the annual Victims of Crime Act report. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
The second item appears at the bottom of page 31 and is related to the expiration of a enhanced public safety funding plan initiative, which was initially only planned to go through fiscal 2025. DLS recommended deleting grant funding for the police accountability grant. That's $4 million in general funds. The agency disagreed and the first House rejected.
Move to concur.
Second.
DLS also recommended deleting enhancement funding for the State Aid for Police Protection Program for the same reasons. The agency disagreed and the first House rejected.
Move to concur.
Item 4 appears at the top of page 32. DLS recommended deleting 3 new positions and associated funding. The agency disagreed and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
The fifth item is also on page 32. DLS recommended withholding funds for the annual Criminal Injuries Compensation Board fiscal 25 report. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Flipping now to page 34, there is an additional first House action. The first House adopted committee narrative for a report on how SAP enhancement funding was used in fiscals 23 through 25.
Move to concur.
Second.
I'll now draw your attention to page 5 of the green packet. This is an additional item which would add language to require that the SAP enhancement be allocated based on violent crime offenses. This is how the agency has allocated the funding in fiscals 23 through 25.
Move to adopt.
For the Maryland Cannabis Administration, on page 35, the DLS recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the first House rejected in order to, on page 36, adopt language requesting a report on the cannabis incubator project.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 37 is the Maryland Thoroughbred Racetrack Operating Authority. DLS recommended some narrative to give us updates of the construction schedule for Pimlico agency. Had no response. First House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 38, DLS recommended reducing funding for the Maryland Historic Revitalization Tax Credit Program's competitive commercial funds. The agency disagreed but recommended that if the reduction were to be taken, it come from the small commercial component of the program. The first House modified the recommendation to reduce funding for the program's small commercial tax credits.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 39, DLS recommended deleting new positions and associated funding provided in supplemental number 1, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
And page 40 is the same new positions, just deficiency for fiscal 25. The House, DLS recommended deleting these new positions and associated funding, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 41, the Maryland Department of Emergency Management's first recommended action is to adopt committee narrative requesting a report on the Resilient Maryland Revolving Loan Fund. The agency did not provide a response, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 42, the second recommended action is to adopt committee narrative requesting a report on state and local cybersecurity efforts. The agency concurred, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 43, the third recommended action is to delete funding for 2 new positions and have the agency reclassify 2 vacant positions. The agency disagreed, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 44, the House adopted an additional action for a committee narrative requesting a report on disaster relief for businesses.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 45, Department of Veterans and Military Families, the first recommended action was a committee narrative requesting quarterly reports on Charlotte Hall Veterans Home facility operations. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
The second recommendation at the bottom of page 45 is also a committee narrative requesting a report on the Maryland Joint Forces Initiative and its progress. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
For the Maryland Automobile Insurance Fund on page 47, the first recommended action is to adopt the following narrative: quarterly financial statements for insured and uninsured divisions. The agency concurred in part. However, the House rejected this action because they introduced a modification on page 48 titled the same. This committee narrative just added additional information regarding assessments and potential rate increases.
Move to concur.
On page 49 is the Office of the Correctional Ombudsman. DLS recommends concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Moving on to page 50 for the Maryland Insurance Administration. The first recommended item is to adopt the following narrative: insurance tracking system project status. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 51 is an additional first House action. This action was to adopt the following narrative: insurance fraud investigation status, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
I have a few items in the additional pages, starting on page 6. For the Maryland Insurance Administration, the first item is a committee narrative for efforts to support insurance industry apprenticeships.
Move to adopt.
Second.
And on page 7 is an additional item for the Maryland Insurance Administration, another committee narrative, this one on report on rate assignment by zip code.
Move to adopt.
Second.
On page 52, we have the Office of Administrative Hearings. DLS recommended adopting narrative regarding alternative dispute resolution techniques and usage measures. The agency concurred. The House modified to change some of the measures collected and how they, some of the measures collected and the language of the narrative.
Move to concur.
On page 54, the recommended action for the comptroller was to concur with the governor's allowance, and the agency concurred, but the House rejected.
I guess move to.
Moving to page 55, it contains the first additional House action, which is committee narrative requesting a report on the requirements for the comptroller to accept cryptocurrency payments, and the House adopted.
Move to reject.
Second.
The second additional House action is committee narrative requesting a report on baby bond accounts, and the House adopted.
Move to reject.
Moving to page 57, the recommended action for the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission is to adopt committee narrative requesting new managing for results measures that track the number of cannabis violations found and the amount of contraband that is confiscated. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 58, for the Lottery and Gaming Control Agency, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Actions pertaining to the Maryland Department of Transportation begin on page 59. The first action is annual budget bill language requesting notification of changes to the MDOT capital program. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 61 is the Secretary's Office. The first item is recommended deletion of a new position. The agency disagreed, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second item is annual budget bill language restricting grants and aid to the amount budgeted. The agency concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 62, the House added narrative requesting a report on cooperation between MTA and WMATA for security for the Purple Line.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 63, for the Office of the Secretary PAYGO, the recommended action was annual budget bill language requiring notification of changes to the capital program. The agency concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 64, there was a supplemental item. The DLS recommended and the House adopted language that makes the appropriation contingent on legislation expanding the use of the funds.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 65 is the WMATA operating budget grant. The recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 66 is the grant, capital grant for WMATA. Same thing, agency concurred with the governor's allowance, House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Debt service requirements begin on page 67. There are two pieces of annual narrative. The first one sets annual debt limits. The agency concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
And on the next page, the second piece of annual language requires a report on non-traditional debt. The agency concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
That takes us over to page 70, which is the beginning for the State Highway Administration. Item 1 on page 70 is the deletion of 8 new positions. The agency disagreed, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Additional House actions are shown on beginning on page 71. They added narrative requesting a report on Adopt a Road program and invasive vines and weeds.
Move to concur.
Second.
On the next page, there was narrative the House added requiring a report on vehicle rentals.
Move to concur.
The state capital program for SHA begins on 73. The recommendation was to concur. However, the House added narrative on the next page, 74, requesting a report on bike lanes for Old Georgetown Road.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 75, a report requesting information on road and bridge safety.
Move to concur.
And on page 8 of your green packet, 3 pieces of narrative. The first one requests a report on coordinating road work and utility work.
Move to adopt.
Second.
On page 9 is restrictive language restricting funds pending a report on the process and approval, a timeline for approving speed cameras for local jurisdictions.
Move to adopt.
And on page 10 is a narrative requesting a report on the process for renaming a highway.
Move to adopt.
Second.
That goes back to the decision document on page 77, which begins the Maryland Port Administration. Item number 1 was recommendation to delete a new position. The agency disagreed. The House rejected this item.
Move to concur.
Item number 2 was narrative requesting quarterly reports on the progress of the Howard Street Tunnel project.
Second.
And on page 78 are additional House actions. Item number 1, restricted funds pending a report on the long-term plan for road salt distribution operations on the North Locust Point Terminal.
Move to concur.
Item number 2 on that same page, requested report on port recovery metrics.
Move to concur.
Second.
On the next page, 79, request for a report on federal funds on a quarterly basis.
Move to concur.
And finally, on the bottom of that page, request for a report on federal Clean Ports Program.
Move to concur.
Second.
In your green packet on page 11 is an additional item for report. This is narrative requesting a report on mitigation efforts for impacts on for dredging for the Sparrows Point Container Terminal that those would have on a couple yacht clubs in the area.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Okay. Takes us back to the decision document on page 80. 81. The recommendation for the court's capital program was to concur with governor's allowance. The agency concurred. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 82, the recommendation for the motor vehicle administration was to concur with the governor's allowance. However, beginning on page 83 were two pieces of narrative the House added. The first requests report on the new insurance coverage verification system.
Move to concur.
And the second one on that page requests a report on the impact of EV adoption on the VEAP program.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 84 is the Motor Vehicle Administration Capital Program, 85. Capital Program, the recommendation was to concur with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Page 86 for the Maryland Transit Administration. The first recommendation was to adopt narrative requesting bi-monthly reports on the Purple Line project. The agency concurred. However, the House slightly modified this narrative as shown on page 87 to include the specific project categories that the report should contain.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 88, begin additional first House actions. The first action, the House deleted funding and 76 new positions in MTA.
Move to concur.
The second item on page 88, the House adopted narrative requesting MTA to prepare a report on MARC train service expansion.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 89 for the MTA capital program, the recommendation was to concur. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
On page 80 begins the Maryland Aviation Administration. The one recommendation was to delete a new position. The agency disagreed, however, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
And on page 91, the PAYGO program for the Aviation Administration, the recommendation to concur with the governor's allowance, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Page 92 begins the Maryland Transportation Authority. The agency is a non-budgeted agency. The agency concurred. However, the House adopted three pieces of narrative beginning on page 93. The first item is narrative requesting quarterly reports providing updates on the Francis Scott Key Bridge reconstruction.
Move to concur.
Second.
The second item the House adopted on page 94 is narrative on the feasibility of capturing only the images of the rear license plates on vehicles at toll facilities.
Move to concur.
The third item, beginning on page 94 and continuing on page 95, is narrative requesting a report on collecting outstanding toll debt.
Move to concur.
Second.
There is one additional item in the green packet on page 12. This is committee narrative requesting MDTA submit a report on assessing bridge vulnerability for the Chesapeake Bay Bridge.
Move to adopt.
Page 96 of the white packet for the capital program for MDTA. Again, the agency is non-budgeted. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 97 is the Department of Natural Resources. First recommendation there is annual narrative, summary of Chesapeake Bay restoration spending. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second action there is the historical and projected Chesapeake Bay restoration spending annual report. The agency concurred in part, asking to have the scope scaled back a little bit. The first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 99, bottom of the page there, recommendation number 3 is for annual narrative on the Chesapeake Atlantic Coastal Bay 2010 Trust Fund. The agency concurred, the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
And Now moving to page 101, these are the additional first house actions. The first action there is to restrict $1 million for the State Lakes Protection and Restoration Fund to be used for a Deep Creek Lake pilot program.
Move to concur.
Second.
Second action there is a whole Watershed Act funding report. The narrative is the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Moving now to the color page packet on page 13. So additional action here provides that $100,000 restricted until a memorandum of understanding is submitted for the Patuxent River wildlands emergency purposes, like for trail maintenance purposes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
On page 14, this is new narrative on recreational fishing data reporting for the Department of Natural Resources.
Move to concur.
Page 15, this is new narrative on enhanced management of the Merkle Wildlife Sanctuary.
Move to adopt.
Second.
All right, moving back to the decision document on page 103. Department of Agriculture, the first recommendation there is to reduce 6 positions in funding. The agency disagreed, noting that they have been able to fill a number of positions since the data was provided in terms of their vacancy rate. First House modified this action to reduce 2 positions, as noted at the middle of the page there in funding.
Move to concur.
Bottom of the 103 and going on to page 104 and 5 is an action related to the Leaders in Environmentally Engaged Farming program. The whole recommendation DLS had was for a $400,000 reduction, and then at the $500,000 level, the funding would be reduced if the program is not entered into legislation, or if it goes through, then $100,000 would be restricted for the purpose of a report. So this first action was that $500,000 gets deleted if there's no bill, and then there's also a reporting requirement if there is a bill.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 105 then, recommendation number 3 is the second component of that, the $400,000 reduction.
Move to concur.
All right, bottom of page 105, recommendation number 4, $2 million federal fund reduction due to a grant that's not received. The agency concurred, the first house adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
So on pages 106 and the following pages, there are a couple of actions taken in supplemental budget number 1. I'd like to draw your attention to the color page packet first, though. It's page 16. This is Department of Legislative Services' overall recommendation for supplemental budget number 1, which is to delete 12 new positions. The House reduced 11 positions, and in the middle of the page there, the Rural Maryland Council position they did retain. So they reduced 11 of the 12 positions. Moving back to your decision document, actions on pages 106, 107, 108, 109 all effectuate the House's plan to reduce only 11 of those 12 positions.
Move to concur.
Second.
So that could be a consent calendar for all those positions, perhaps? Or?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, consent calendar.
Excellent.
That for you. Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services begins on page 111 with the administration and offices function. Item 1 restricts $500,000 pending a report on the incorporation of feedback from the Office of Legislative Audits on their inmate healthcare contracts. The agency concurred and the House modified this item. You can see the modification on 112. The modification adds more specific reporting requests for staffing numbers and liquidated damages.
Move to concur.
Moving to page 114 for item 2. This item restricts $500,000 pending a report on the agency's strategy to complete 2 major information technology projects. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 3 is on page 116. It restricts $100,000 pending a report on 3-year recidivism data. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
There's an additional page on page 17 of the green packet which restricts $1 million pending the submission of a letter confirming that DPSCS has submitted all of the reports requested in the 2025 JCR.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Item 4, back to the white packet on page 116, is narrative requesting a report on the Justice Reinvestment Act. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 5 on 117 is narrative requesting the inclusion of correctional program participation measures in the annual Managing for Results submission. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 6 is on 118. It's narrative requesting a report on compliance with the Public Information Act. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 7 restricts $250,000 pending a report on the agency's plan to eliminate the use of mandatory overtime. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to increase the amount restricted to $500,000.
Second.
Item 8 is on page 120. It restricts $200,000 pending the submission of the second of 4 quarterly hiring and attrition reports. The agency concurred but requested a due date of the 30th of each month because of when their workday data becomes available. The House modified the report due date to the 25th of each of those months.
Move to concur.
All right, and item 9 is on page 123 of the white packet. It recommends deleting $4.1 million in general funds for the new correctional officer body-worn camera program in correctional facilities. The agency disagreed, and the House rejected the recommendation.
Move to concur.
There's an additional first House action on page 124. It's narrative requesting a report on the potential use of blockchain technology for managing inmate records, and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Moving to corrections on page 125. Item 1 restricts $100,000 pending a report on the treatment of transgender individuals. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
At the bottom of page 127, item 2 is narrative requesting a report on delinquent payments owed to Maryland Correctional Enterprises. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 3 is narrative requesting a report on women's pre-release programming. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 4 is on page 130. It's narrative requesting a report on the rollout of the reentry passport program. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
There's an additional first House action on page 132 of the white packet. It reduces the general fund appropriation by $700,000 to account for liquidated damages estimated by the agency. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
On 133, community supervision begins. Item 1 restricts $150,000 pending a report on the agency's strategy to improve the safety of community supervision agents. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 2 makes $429,000 for body-worn cameras contingent on the enactment of legislation allowing their use. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 3 is narrative requesting a report on DPP agent caseloads. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 4 is narrative requesting a report on the agency's transition to a new risk assessment tool. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
All right, and then we have an additional first House action on page 137. It does 2 things. The first part is intent language that body-worn camera policies be the mandatory subject of collective bargaining with the employee union. The second part of the action restricts $150,000 pending a report on the policies and costs associated with body-worn cameras for community supervision agents. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Moving to the Police and Correctional Training Commissions, on page 139, DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Finally, the Division of Pretrial Detention and Services is on page 140. Item 1 restricts $100,000 pending a report on compliance with the Duval v. Moore decree. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
And that is it for public safety.
Second.
Page 142 is the Maryland Department of the Environment. First recommendation there is for annual narrative on the Maryland Used Tire Cleanup and Recycling Fund. The agency concurred, the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second item there is for annual narrative as well, enforcement and inspection position strength assessment. The agency concurred, the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Page 144 for the Maryland Environmental Service, a recommendation was to adopt narrative requesting an annual funding statement. The agency concurred and the House adopted.
Move to concur.
There's one additional action on page 146. The House adopted narrative requesting a report on establishing municipal recycling in Ocean City.
Move to concur.
Second.
The Department of Juvenile Services appears on page 147. DLS recommended reducing the general fund appropriation by $4.2 million for the enhanced services continuum. The agency disagreed and the first House rejected.
Move to concur.
The second item was a DLS recommendation to delete funding for the Catoctin Treatment Center due to its absence from the facility's master plan. The agency disagreed, but stated that it was prepared to explore alternative approaches to spending the funding. The first House rejected.
Move to concur.
There's an additional first House action, which appears on page 148. The House restricted the $3 million for the Catoctin Treatment Center to instead reopen the Alfred D. Noyes Children's Center as an adolescent drug treatment center. If you were to adopt this, I would recommend adding the words "to commitment" following detention in the first sentence.
Move to reject.
If you turn now to the additional page packet, there is language beginning on page 18 and going on page 19. This would restrict $500,000 for a report due September 1st on departmental practices and tools, recidivism evaluation, and the availability of evidence-based services following some hearings that were held towards the beginning of session.
Move to adopt.
Committee narrative also appears in the additional page packet on page 20. This narrative would be for a report on community case management specialist apprenticeship program potential.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Now returning to the decision document for the Department of State Police on page 149, DLS recommended deleting grant funding for the Maryland Sheriff's Association due to the expiration of the Enhanced Public Safety Funding Initiative after fiscal 25. The agency disagreed and the first House rejected.
Move to concur.
The second recommendation was to delete double budgeted special funds and delete 15 new regular positions. The agency concurred in part, agreeing to the removal of the double budgeted money. The first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Number 3 was recommended to delete funding for the Vehicle Theft Prevention Council so that there would be the expected level of expenditure amount remaining. The agency disagreed and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Page 150 and 151, there was a DLS recommendation to add a section withholding funds pending the uniform crime report. The agency concurred and the first House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
There was also an additional first House action, which appears on page 152. This narrative was for a report on consent decree and federal grants due July 1.
Move to concur.
And I'll draw your attention to the last page of the green additional page packet. There's committee narrative, which requests quarterly reports on personnel measures.
Move to adopt.
Second.
All righty, we're getting there. I will bring you back, please, to page 1 of the white packet. for the judiciary. First item is DLS recommendation to add language reducing the appropriation by $687,742 in general funds and abolishing 5 new positions. Judiciary concurred in part, accepting the deletion of 2 of the positions and disagreed with the remainder. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
The second item, also on page 1, is language added to the general fund appropriation to reduce it by $393,939 to increase turnover expectancy among new positions. Judiciary disagreed. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item number 3 is a reduction of $600,000 in general funds for the purpose of duplicating equipment expenses to align with fiscal 2024 expenses. Judiciary concurred in part, requesting the Chief Justice have the authority to allocate the cut. The House modified this to give the Chief Justice that authority.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item number 4 can be found on page 2. Adds language to the general fund appropriation restricting $8.6 million for the purpose of providing attorneys in accordance with the Supreme Court's holding in DeWolf v. Richmond. The agency concurred. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item number 5 restricts $250,000 of the appropriation for the appointed attorney program pending submission of a report on the costs and utilization of the program. Judiciary concurred in part, requesting a change in what data should be provided. The first House modified the report to, change the data provided.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 4, we have item number 6, which reduces $670,000 in general funds for salary increases for contractual personnel to align with increases for state employees. Judiciary concurred in part. The House modified to grant authority to allocate the reduction to the Chief Justice.
Move to concur.
Item number 7 reduces $1 million in general funds for equipment repairs and maintenance expenses. The Judiciary concurred in part. The House adopted, the House modified, keeping the cut and giving the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the reduction across the judiciary.
Move to concur.
Second.
Okay. Page 5, item number 9, bottom of page 4, please, for item number 8, is a increase in the contractual employee turnover expectancy to better align with fiscal 2025 levels. It's a reduction of $435,000 in general funds. The House modified this to grant the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the cut.
Move to concur.
Now for item 9, reduction of $150,000 for the purpose of providing attorneys in accordance with DeWolf v. Richmond. Judiciary concurred. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item number 10 is the middle of page 5, reduction of $175,000 in general funds for travel expenses to align with fiscal 2024 actuals. Judiciary concurred in part. The House modified to give the Chief Justice authority to allocate the reduction.
Move to concur.
Item number 11 is narrative requesting the annual report on court performance measures. The Judiciary concurred. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Page 6 has item number 12, narrative requesting a report on problem-solving court performance and funding. Judiciary concurred. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item 13 is narrative requesting a report on the judgeship need for fiscal 2027. Judiciary concurred. House adopted.
I'll move to concur.
Second.
Item 14 is found at the top of page 7. It's a reduction of $500,000 in general funds made for the purpose of communications expenses to align with fiscal 2024. The Judiciary concurred in part. The House modified to grant the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the reduction across the judiciary.
Move to concur.
Item number 15 reduces $900,000 in general funds for printing expenses. Judiciary concurred in part. The House modified to grant the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the reduction.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item number 16 at the bottom of page 7 is a reduction of $1.2 million in general funds for software license expenses to decrease the funding available for additional licenses. The Judiciary disagreed. The House modified, keeping the amount of the cut the same, but giving the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the reduction for that purpose across the judiciary.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item number 17 is on page 8. It's a reduction of $1.25 million in general funds for contracted information technology services. Judiciary disagreed. The House modified, keeping the total amount of the cut and giving the giving the Chief Justice the authority to allocate the reduction.
Move to concur.
Item 18 is narrative requesting the annual report on the judiciary's major information technology development projects. The judiciary concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
Item 19 is on page 9. It's narrative requesting a report on the Land Records Improvement Fund balance. Judiciary concurred, the House adopted.
Move to concur.
Item number 20 is narrative regarding quarterly reports on the private home detention monitoring program. The judiciary concurred in part. The House modified this to remove a couple of the bullet points that were included in the original recommendation.
I move to concur.
Second.
I will now direct your attention to page 12, please, for the Office of the Public Defender. The first item is a recommendation to reduce general funds for increasing turnover expectancy for contractual positions to 10%. It's $94,198. The agency disagreed. The House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second recommendation is to reduce $1,697,900 in general funds and delete 12 new office secretary positions, 9 new office clerk positions, 2 administrative positions, and 2 information technology related positions. The agency disagreed. The House rejected.
Move to concur.
Second.
On page 13, we have the Office of the Attorney General. DLS recommended adopting narrative regarding the final implementation and future costs of the program, report on that, rather. The agency concurred. The House modified this to add one additional part to the report, a recommendation on a permanent funding source for the program.
Move to concur.
On page 15, we have the Office of the State Prosecutor. DLS recommended concurring with the governor's allowance. Agency concurred. House adopted.
Move to concur.
Second.
We're back.
All righty. I think it would probably be good for Mr. Chair, for Ms. Banks and I to just take a look and make sure we hit everything in the document real quick.
Yes.
So we'll do that with by your leave.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all. This will conclude the Public Safety, Transportation, and Environment Subcommittee decision hearing. Tomorrow, full committee.
Good job.
Thank you all. Concludes our hearing.